The Jeff Younger Show is on. Dedicated to my sons, James and Jude. Okay, you're in a bar. Guy next to you says something stupid about politics. Do you A, pull out a logical syllogism and prove he's wrong using first principles and logical deduction? Do you B, ask him questions until he contradicts himself? Or C, do you tell a story that makes him look like a jackass? Well, most of you would probably pick C based on the occasion. Some of you might pick B. Almost none of you would pick A. Here's the thing. You're probably right, but you don't know why you're right. And that means when you do pick wrong, when you try to reason with an idiot or tell stories to a philosopher, you're just going to lose, man. So today I'm teaching you the difference between demonstration, dialectic, and rhetoric. Not because it's interesting, but because knowing the difference will make you more effective at everything you do that involves other people, which is basically everything. YouTube's algorithm is designed by people who think you need to be protected from ideas like the ones on this channel. They're not going to recommend me to you. So if you want to keep getting this content, you have to tell the machine. Subscribe, click the bell. Look, I'm not building a movement. I'm not selling you a course. I'm giving you information that took me 35 years to acquire, and I'm giving it to you for free because my sons can't hear it any other way. If that's useful to you, subscribe. If it's not, go watch something else. But if you're still here, you're probably the kind of man who should be here. So act like it. Subscribe. Well, let's start with why this matters. Every time you open your mouth to convince someone of something, you're making a choice. Most people make it unconsciously. They use the same approach with everyone, their boss, their girlfriend, the DMV clerk, their drinking buddies, their wife. This is like using a hammer for every job. Sometimes you need a saw. Sometimes you need a screwdriver. And if you only have a hammer, you're probably going to break some shit that didn't need breaking. And you're probably going to fail to be able to build things that should have been built. Now, Aristotle identified three fundamentally different ways to argue. Now, I'm not talking about like argument styles. I'm not talking about the way you talk or anything like that. I'm talking about different kinds of argumentation. And they're as different from each other as a knife is from a wrench. Here's what they are. Demonstration is proof from necessary truths, where there are sure starting points and informed participants. It'll produce certain knowledge in those who can follow it. But I'm going to warn you, most people can't. Dialectic is examination through question and answer among informed participants. It tests belief and it reveals contradictions. It really doesn't give you the truth the way demonstration does. It gives you the best explanation. Rhetoric is persuasion through probable arguments when you're among uninformed participants. It moves people to action on practical matters that have to be taken care of right now. Now, each one of these has a proper domain. In other words, they're appropriate in some occasions, they're not appropriate in others, okay? And each one of them used in the wrong context it's not only not going to be convincing, it's going to make you look like a fool or a fraud. So you really need to understand this. So let's start with demonstration, which we could say arguing with the wise, but I'm just going to say arguing with the knowledgeable. So you start with a demonstration because it's very limited, and if people can follow it and there are no errors, it's ironclad. It will tell you what's true or false based on the assumptions that you made. A demonstration is just a deductive proof that begins from first principles, truths that everybody that you're talking to will assume are self-evident or assume for the purposes of argument. And then it makes necessary deductions from those, okay? And if the principles are true and the logic is valid, the conclusion is absolutely certain. So here's an example. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. That's demonstrative reasoning. That's an extraordinarily simple one. It's not a practical one. I get you. But it's still a good one for us to look at because it shows that the conclusion follows necessarily from the premises that are already known to be true. Now, suppose we're in a crowd that doesn't accept that all men are mortal. What if we're in a crowd that doesn't accept that Socrates is in fact a man? Well, it wouldn't work, right? The group you're talking to has to accept the premises, and then you logically deduce from the assumed premises. Now, here's what you really need to get here. I mean, this was hard for me as a young man, okay, because my tendency was I was a math nerd. I read philosophy, when I was 11. I started reading philosophy books early. And so I was exposed to this idea of demonstration. Here's the thing. Demonstrations aren't really designed to persuade people. What they do is instruct people. That's why they're called demonstrations. They show something that if the steps are correct, it just is what it is. If you look at proofs in modern Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory in mathematics, they just are what they are, man. It doesn't matter what you think about them. It doesn't matter what you believe about them. If you accept the axioms of Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory, the theorems are true whether you like it or not, right? So they're really meant to instruct. They're not a persuasive device. Now, when you demonstrate something, that means you're not trying to win someone over. You're not trying to persuade them. You're trying to show them just simply what necessarily follows from what they already accept as certain. Now, there are some preconditions for this to work, and you're going to find these preconditions almost never hold in the real world. The first one is that they have to already understand the first principles. And my friend, if anything characterizes the modern world, it's a disagreement on first principles. So as a young man, you're entering into a world, probably in the history of the world, where there's maximal disagreement within your community on what are first principles. Second, they have to have the mental discipline to follow the reasoning. My experience has been 5% of people that I meet can do that, and if on a good day. Like, I've worked in companies where no one could do that. Companies with over 10,000 employees, and literally none of them could do it. And the third thing is that they have to care about the truth more than winning. Now, typically that can mean a couple of things. Maybe their character is such, they're oriented to the truth. Remember, we talked about the 3 kinds of men in previous videos, right? There's men who love honors, men who love money, and men who love knowledge. If they're a knowledge lover, they're inherently going to want to know the truth. If they're one of the other 2 types of men, an honor lover, knowledge lover, then the truth has to give them something that they really want, more important than for them to beat you in the argument, right? You have to care more about the truth than about winning for whatever reason. That's also very rare in the modern world. So you can almost never use demonstration, is what I'm telling you. That's why the study of formal logic and informal logic can only go so far. I do think there's a moral case to be made to teach yourself formal demonstration. And it's basically this. I think it's immoral to try to persuade people of things that are not true. And you would know things are true only by demonstration. So demonstration gives you a base from which you can know what you should try to persuade people of. You don't want to mislead people. But basically, I'm telling you, demonstrations work only with a small subset of the people. They have to be extremely intelligent and competent. They have to be patient. They have to be oriented to the truth, not to profit and winning. And with people who have been educated kind of in logic, it's got to be with people who value knowledge over opinions or their status in a community, that sort of thing. And again, it's just pretty rare. So let me try to give you some situations where it would be appropriate. You're teaching a student who's ready for advanced material. Maybe you're teaching mathematics. I've had to teach mathematics. Discussing matters with subject matter experts. I used to work with teams of mathematicians doing optimization systems in oil refineries and gas pipelines and things like that. Obviously, if our stuff doesn't work, shit blows up and people die. So yeah, we care more about the truth than about winning arguments. That's typical of experts. How many experts do you really know? There just aren't many, right? It's very rare actually to encounter experts. Proving something in writing to people that are going to scour it for errors. So a lot of times when I've had to do political writings, I know that my enemies are going to really attack it. I've had to go up against left-wing groups who I knew were going to get the top experts in the world to just, vet my writings. Well, first of all, I start with a logical demonstration to make sure that I'm ironclad on that, right? But it can also be something else. And we'll talk about this in some later videos when we start talking about education. But, demonstrations are great ways for you personally to build up systematic knowledge in a field that you have actually mastered. You can learn a lot from doing logical demonstrations in your own field. Like one of the things I found very surprising in mathematics was that the idea of a function is actually in some ways, more fundamental than the concept of quantity. And that was really surprising to me, that relations could be the most basic thing, not numbers. I learned that through just strict application of logic and category theory. So there's it can really help you in certain fields if you're a true expert at it. When does demonstration fail? Well, it fails most of the time. Like I said, it's going to fail spectacularly with uneducated people, undisciplined people, and with the crowd. Does anything typify the people that you encounter every day in the modern world? Uneducated, they have all the credentials in the world, but they have no education. They're undisciplined. People today can't even read books anymore, right? So they're undisciplined right from the get-go. And then you're dealing with crowds, and in crowds, crowds can create a kind of situation where people give up individual autonomy. Crowds can take on a psychology of their own, right? And it's just not useful for that. Let's look at why these kinds of people and situations just aren't appropriate for demonstration. First of all, demonstrations are just too damn long. Okay. I remember going through Gödel's incompleteness proof. It's 52 pages long, man, and it's pretty dense. Like when you break it out, when I break it out with my notes, and it was 180 pages of my own notes from it, right? They're just too long. It requires setting things up, the first principles, then you have to build step by step to the conclusion. It's kind of boring because it starts with a thing that you already know, and you only get the conclusion at the end, the payoffs at the end. Most people aren't patient enough to get there. In order to, get somebody to do that, they're going to have to follow you all the way through and be very patient with you, right? If you've ever been to a math conference, that's basically what a math presentation looks like. And how many people go to math conferences? Not many. Second, they're really just not persuasive. A demonstration is not persuasive to those who don't already accept the first principles. And like I said, there's no general agreement on first principles anymore. I mean, in my dad's day, back in the 1960s, the 1940s to the 1960s, when he was a young man, there was general agreement on first principles. Demonstrations might have been more common back then. But you can't demonstrate anything to someone who just doesn't grasp or agree with your starting points, all right? All you can do is just assert things he doesn't believe to prove things he really just doesn't care about. Okay, that's not going to get you anywhere. The third reason that they typically don't work is that they just don't reveal any human character. They actually don't require any deliberate choices, right? A demonstration is just totally impersonal. In fact, we can write computer programs to do automated theorem proving. It's fine, it works. It's just pure logic. And human beings, especially human beings of a normal IQ and below, they're just not moved by pure logic. They're moved more by human characters, human passions, than they are by logic. And even more so by stories, which are kind of like extended analogies, right? Extended examples. These are the things that average IQ people and below are going to do, or people who are not experts in, but for example, I marvel at pipe welders. I just think it's a magic trick what they can do. I'm not an expert at it. So when they talk about what they're doing, I can't understand it, man. It's a physical skill. I just don't understand it. So they have to tell me stories and analogies for me to understand it. You see, but when they talk to each other, they could use logical demonstrations. You see what I mean? It can be very domain specific. So demonstrations are not widely applicable. But I do think I should give you some practical applications, right? So first thing is just stop trying to prove things. to people who are just not equipped to follow proofs, right? Your girlfriend doesn't want a syllogism about why you should spend Thanksgiving with your family instead of hers. Your boss is an MBA, so he's a average IQ. He doesn't want a mathematical proof that your strategy is going to produce a profit. Save demonstrations for those very rare cases where you're actually dealing with an expert who has the knowledge, the discipline, and the desire to follow formal reasoning. And for everyone else, you're going to have to use other tools. I'm going to give you those next. Dialectic is the second kind of argumentation. Now, dialectic is the art of examination through questions and answers. It's a system of cross-examination. If you've ever been in a professional discussion with engineers, this is what they do with each other across the table, right? Unlike demonstration, dialectic does not start from necessary truths. It actually starts from reputable beliefs. That's different than starting from first principles, right? Reputable beliefs can be doubted, but still used because they're mostly and probably true, okay? Now, what Aristotle calls this endoxa, okay? This reputable beliefs that most people accept. These are things that basically seem true to everyone or to most people or to the wise. For example, a greater good encompasses a lower good, right? If you have a stable and happy family, then you're going to have stable and happy relationship between the husband and the wife. You'll likely have a stable and happy relationship between the father and the children and the mother and the children. You see what I mean about higher goods? These are kind of things that people just kind of commonly accept. So the dialectician's method is to take your opponent's stated position, get him to agree to certain premises that everyone generally accepts, and then show him that these premises lead to conclusions that would contradict his earlier position. And this will cause him to modify his position, which then starts the questioning process again. So a classic example is when Socrates asks, what is justice? And then he just basically demolishes every definition offered, showing that it contradicts other commonly held beliefs that no one would doubt. Now, this is not trickery. This isn't about, so there is a thing there's blood sport debates are just very popular on the internet right now. This is not about that kind of stuff. Okay. It's about examination between two parties who are seeking the best explanation, not two parties who want to do each other in a public way and ruin each other's reputations or whatever. Okay. You actually can't do dialectic with people like that. We'll get into that. The goal here is to reveal whether a position is incoherent or self-contradictory, and we'll finally find the explanation that is the most coherent and has the fewest contradictions and relies on reputable beliefs that we can all basically say are true, right? So key factors with dialectic. First, it requires an answerer. It has to be someone that's willing to engage with you honestly. It proceeds by question and answer. It doesn't make assertions and then make logical demonstrations, okay? It proceeds by question and answer. It tests positions rather than establishing the truth. A lot of people are confused about dialectic and think it gives you the truth. No, it gives you the best explanation that you can come up with your social group of interlocutors, right? It tests positions to find the best one. It operates in the realm of belief, not knowledge. Demonstrations operate in the realm of knowledge. When we do a demonstration, it's just ironclad. If you accept the axioms, the proof follows, right? Otherwise, there's no mistake. But dialectic really is about beliefs. What is the best belief that we should hold? Not certain knowledge, okay? So dialectic is, you can think of it as a more philosophic exercise. You can sharpen your thinking, you can expose weak arguments, but it has some limitations. The first thing is that, hey man, let's be honest. How many people do you know that can examine their own beliefs and reflect on them like that? How many people do you know that are your intellectual equal in the field where you'd want to do dialectic? It's good for testing a position before you commit to it publicly, right? That's why it's different than blood sport debates. A lot of people have confused this, that blood sport debates are an attempt to get at the truth. They're not really. Philosophical inquiry, where you're like genuinely seeking the truth, not some victory, dialectic would work well there. Now, here's an interesting thing about dialectic. You can do it with yourself. Okay, you can play devil's advocate with yourself. You start with a position. Maybe it could be practical. You know, it could be, do I invest money in this company? And then you question it, you interrogate it. If you notice throughout all of my videos, I tell you to pay attention to the questions I'm asking more than the answers I'm giving, because I'm trying to teach you how to do dialectic with yourself. At the very least, you can trust yourself. You're at the same IQ level with yourself, right? You should be able to talk to yourself and question yourself, and try to get to the best beliefs that you should hold, right? Let me talk about now when dialectic just totally fails. 3 types of people. First, if you got a dishonest answerer, it's just not going to work. If your opponent just won't grant obvious premises or keeps changing position, dialectic is just completely useless. You cannot examine beliefs if everybody isn't being honest. How many honest interlocutors are you going to find? Think about it. Second, you just can't do this with a crowd. You can't do question and answer with a mob. They're just not going to follow an argument. They'll interrupt. They'll get bored. Dialectic requires patience, good faith from both parties. Both sides have to be willing to basically modify their position until they find the best set of beliefs. You just can't do that with a crowd. You know, when you're doing any kind of debate with a crowd, you're either doing rhetoric or you're doing blood sports, right? Third, just ignorant people. If someone just doesn't hold reputable beliefs to begin with, if their thinking is so muddled that they don't have coherent opinions themselves, dialectic can't help them, okay? You can't reveal contradictions in positions that people don't actually hold or that people are intellectually incapable of discovering for themselves. And this brings me to what I call the Socratic trap. A lot of young men who discover dialectic make, well, I mean, it was a fatal mistake for Socrates. So I'll say they make a fatal mistake. They just try to use it on everyone. So they ask their father, but why? Until he loses his temper. They try to out-Socrates their boss into contradicting himself. They turn every conversation into a cross-examination. This doesn't make you look smart, man. This doesn't even give you the things that dialectic can give you. Your interlocutors are probably not capable of doing dialectic with you. What it does make you is an insufferable ass. And even more important than being an insufferable ass, even worse than that, it just makes you ineffective. Okay? So now you're an ineffective, insufferable ass. And that's really, trust me, something as a young man you just don't fucking want to be. Dialectic is a tool for examination, not persuasion. Stop using it for persuasion, okay? The Socratic method is not meant for persuasion. If you use it improperly, it just shows that you're more interested in winning than in accomplishing anything, and people are just going to hate you for this, and you're just going to just be perceived as an asshole, and most companies fire assholes, most projects fire assholes, and nobody's going to cooperate with you, so don't do that. Save dialectic for situations where examination is actually the goal. Let me say that again. Save dialectic for situations where examination is actually the goal. For everything else, you're going to use rhetoric. Well, this is the part where I'm supposed to beg you to subscribe. I'm supposed to say something like, smash the button or join the community. I'm not going to do that. I'm a 60-year-old man who's been in more fights with the system than you've had birthdays, son. The information I'm putting out is either going to reach the men who need it, it's going to disappear. YouTube shows my videos to people who subscribe. That's just how it is. That's the real world. It hides them from people who don't subscribe. That's just how it works. So if you want more of this, hit subscribe, hit the bell, or don't. I'm not your mother. So you can see that demonstration and dialectic have very limited application. What you're mainly going to use in your life is rhetoric. And your schools never taught you anything about rhetoric. You don't know anything about rhetoric. So I'm going to give you just some basics here. Future videos will go in depth on this stuff. But right now, I just want you to understand what it is and when it's appropriate. Rhetoric is when you're arguing with the many. Okay. Even if it's just one person, but they're so ignorant of whatever you're talking about, or their intellectual ability is so low, they have the effect of the lowered IQ of a crowd, right? So rhetoric operates in the realms of possibility, probability. It doesn't operate in the realm of certainty like demonstration, and it doesn't operate in the realm of what's the best belief to hold, what's the best explanation. It's about probably. It's basically helping people answer the question, what should I probably do here? What should I probably believe here? What's probably the case here? Okay. Its basic tool is what Aristotle called the enthymeme. It's kind of like the syllogism that we did in demonstration, but you basically leave out all the middle terms. Okay. So this leads to a probable conclusion because we didn't actually put in the middle term. We didn't have a full logical demonstration. Let me give you an example. He's breathing hard and sweating. He must have been running. Now, it's not certain. He could be sick. He could be having a heart attack. Maybe he's having a panic attack. Maybe he just sweats a lot and breathes hard. He's just a dude that does that. No, I mean, none of that is outside the realm of possibility. It's simply not probable. Most likely he's been running, and likelihood is good enough for us to take action on. So this is why the enthymeme works so well. Here's kind of how it works. If you do a full demonstration, you put in all the steps. And it requires a lot of patience and time. And remember, you don't get the payoff till the very end, so it's boring in between. But an enthymeme just leaves out all these obvious steps. The listener supplies the intermediate steps of the logical demonstration with his own common sense. Now, this is very crucial for understanding how rhetoric actually works. So of all the parts in the video, you need to listen to this part. When people fill in the gaps in your enthymemes, they have actually, in a way, psychologically taken ownership of the argument because they provided information into the argument to get to the conclusion, okay? That is far more convincing than if you spelled it all out yourself. There's a very important principle of persuasion. Always let other people fill things in. I'll give you an example. I used to have work for a software company. I had a $20 million sales quota. When I would send out an initial proposal letter, I would always include a mistake in it on purpose. And they would always redline it and say, oh, no, that's not what we talked about. We talked about this. That number's slightly wrong. Why would I do that? Because as soon as they added that information into the proposal letter, which is really like a letter of intent, they own that letter. Half that letter is theirs now, right? They put that information in there, and they're psychologically invested in it, right? The enthymeme works exactly the same way. Okay, and remember, a sales close, to get a close in a sale, and to get somebody to sign off on a $5 million software deal, that's a piece of rhetoric. You're not doing logical demonstrations. Okay, they have to believe probably that there'll be ROI from this that's sufficient to cover whatever their company requires, right? It's not certain, but it's probably true. Do you understand how that would work? If you don't, go into the comments and ask me questions and I'll clarify, because it's really the most important point in this whole video. So let's compare a demonstration and an enthymeme so you can see why filling in works. Here's a full demonstration. All exercise causes sweating. Running is an exercise. He was running, therefore he is sweating. I mean, you didn't even want me to get to the end of that, right? You're already falling asleep in this video, just me even going through that. But here's the enthymeme. He's sweating and breathing hard. He must have been running. So you've kind of filled in all the other parts, right? And it's more persuasive to you. So the enthymeme is faster, it's more natural, it's more persuasive. It gives a kind of psychological ownership of your arguments to the audience. Okay, so that's why it's really powerful. Why does rhetoric like this work? Because it deals with the kinds of things that people actually decide about. Practical matters that always admit of being otherwise. Okay, you don't deliberate about whether 2 + 2 = 4 You don't deliberate about math problems like that, right? You deliberate about whether to take this job or take that job, whether to trust this person or not trust that person, whether to act now, wait later. This is the kind of things that you're dealing with. These are things that have the character of being mostly or probably true, more or less certain. Okay. These are not matters where we have absolutely certain knowledge. They're just matters of probability, character, and emotion, and rhetoric addresses all three of these. Okay. And I guess I should break off at this point and talk about these three modes. In rhetoric, there's three kinds of appeals that you can make in an enthymeme to persuade people. The first one is through character, and that's who the people think you are. There's three things that you have to have if you want to be persuasive. You have to be credible. They have to think you know what you're saying and you're knowledgeable. Okay. They have to believe you're trustworthy. You're not going to lie to them. And they have to believe that you're benevolent, that the reason you're trying to persuade them is to help them. Okay. You have to have those three things, right? And that's the character that people look at when they find somebody persuasive. The third is emotional appeals. And these are arguments that arouse feelings that will predispose you to a certain conclusion, right? If you have an audience of families that have children, showing that a particular course of action would harm children is very likely to arouse emotions that will predispose them to your conclusions, where you want to avoid this harm for children. Another way is through logical argument. Reasoning itself seems sound, even if it's not certain. Sometimes we can do reasoning just from probable premises, but like I said, that's probably the weakest one. Well, here's what's something very interesting about this. And I've never actually heard anybody write about this. I've never read a book about this, but it's something I personally noticed. In my dad's day, so when he grew up as a young man from the 40s up into the 60s, arguments from emotion predominated. If you go and listen to speeches of presidents, for example, speeches of political leaders, world political leaders, they're all attempting to stir the passions of the audience in order to predispose them to a conclusion. And it often worked, right? I think modern audiences in our age are so cynical from being exposed to mass advertising for so long that tries to manipulate our emotions that we just kind of discount that a lot more. And what I've noticed is what really makes you persuasive in the modern world and young men in the world that you're going into, you need to have the character of persuasion. So whereas pathos or emotional appeals may have dominated in the past, ethos or character dominates now. You need to make sure that you appear to be knowledgeable and benevolent. Knowledgeable and benevolent. And that's more important today almost than anything that you say. It predisposes people to believe you. When should you use rhetoric? Well, I told you that most of the time that's what you're going to use. Persuading crowds or simple people or uninformed people, arguing matters of practical action that don't involve theoretical truth, speaking to people who lack technical knowledge about what you're doing, moving people to actually go do something. We call that conviction, right? You convict someone and they'll go and you want them to go and do something, not just believe something. Anytime the goal is conviction, not certainty, you can basically say you're going to do rhetoric. Okay. The crowd is your natural audience. And if you're training yourself for rhetoric, you should think of it that way. The crowd is your natural audience. Aristotle was kind of explicit about this. He said you should always, when you're doing rhetoric, the imaginary judge you have in your head when you're developing a speech or a proposal, whatever it might be, is a simple person, a person of slightly lower IQ than average, and a person who knows nothing about your field or what you're talking about. Rhetoric is just designed for ordinary people in ordinary situations. Now, I'm not saying this because I'm contemptuous of people with lower IQs. I'm not saying this because I'm contemptuous of people who are ignorant or uninformed. Again, this show is about realism. I mean, the reality is most people are just not philosophers. Most people are not mathematicians. Most people don't have technical training. Most people don't make decisions based on probability, character, emotion, or demonstrative proofs, right? If you want to move the world, you have to persuade the world as it actually is, just not as you wish it to be, okay? And that means dealing with the facts of how people are persuaded. I can tell you this, can be very disturbing. I've given logical demonstrations as a young man, absolutely ironclad logical demonstrations. You find they provoke skepticism. But if you give a single well-chosen example, it will persuade people and they'll give you millions of dollars. And I could have just cherry-picked that example. I could just pull that example out of my ass, right? So you got to understand that's just how the world is. Like, people should be persuaded by demonstrations. They're not. It provokes skepticism, actually, in the uneducated. Whereas a well-chosen example with an enthymeme is very persuasive and will get people to sign contracts with you for millions of dollars. That was a real eye-opener for me in my late 20s when I realized this fact, right? So how do you know which tool to use? Obviously, it's important. Here's a framework that you can use, and this comes from notes that I took for myself in my early 30s when I was struggling with this, because I was in sales and I had to figure this out. First thing is what I would call the situation. The classical rhetorician called it kairos. It means the overall occasion for the rhetoric. The first one is, who is your audience? Are they wise and educated? That weighs towards demonstration. Are they intellectual equals, and are they willing to be examined and to vary their opinions based on questioning? You could probably do dialectic with those people. Everyone else, you're going to use rhetoric. What's your goal in the communication? Is it to teach certain knowledge? Okay, if I'm teaching topology to somebody, I'm trying to teach certain knowledge, right? That's demonstration. Is it to test a position, to wargame something? That's probably dialectic. Is it to persuade people to do something, or to give you something, or to take something, or whatever, persuading people to do whatever it is? That's rhetoric. What about the subject matter? Does it deal with necessary truths? Does that matter? Does it deal with debatable beliefs and which beliefs we really should hold? What are the best beliefs? It's probably dialectic. Does it deal with practical affairs that are inherently uncertain? Well, then you're back to rhetoric. And as you can see, all three, most of the time, you're just going to do rhetoric. Here are some common mistakes that people make. And I've seen all of these. I've seen young men do all of these. I have done every single one of these myself, and I have crashed and burnt in front of people. Like, I have completely done. I've even destroyed my reputation on a couple of occasions in companies doing this, okay? Trying to demonstrate to people who just don't grasp your first principles. They just can't understand them. Like, as a working statistician, I've had many occasions where the people I'm talking to are business people, and they just simply cannot understand the statistical ideas that I'm talking about. They're just going to say you're an autistic nerd. They're just going to dismiss you. At best, could be worse. Using dialectic on people that won't engage honestly. Like, this person's not going to engage honestly, but you waste your damn time questioning and trying to be honest with this person. Not going to work, man. It's a waste of your time. But it can be the flip side too. Suppose you're dealing with a technical expert. You're dealing with an engineer, and you're talking about his field, and you try to use rhetoric on him. Okay, you do use character and emotional appeals on him. He's just going to think you're a bullshitter and just completely, not only will he discount you, he'll hate you and never talk to you again because he thinks you're a bullshitter now. You can't use rhetoric in that situation, right? That dialectic's appropriate for that situation. And then finally, you don't want to mix these modes. I've seen this happen too. I did this, not as much, but there's a very intelligent young man that I worked with back in the late 90s. And I never could get him to stop doing this. And he literally just got fired at every job he was ever at, even though he's probably the most competent applied to mathematics guy that I've ever met. He would mix these modes up. He would start off giving a logical demonstration and then wind up going back to rhetoric, making enthymeme appeals, even appeals to emotions. and then switch up and start having a dialectic with somebody and then modify the premises and go back to the logical demonstration. You can see like this is very frustrating with people. Okay. Don't ever mix the modes. You're either going to do demonstration, probably not. So you can rule that out 90% of the cases, or you're going to do dialectic. That's 5% of the 10% that are left. And then most of the time, you're just going to do rhetoric. 90% of the time, you'll do rhetoric. Okay. So don't ever mix those up. You're going to do one or the other, or you're going to just like freak people out. And I've seen this. If you think of the characteristic of really bad speeches that you've seen or bad presentations, it's because they're mixing the modes. So here's the basic tactical principle. I always like to break this shit down for you, right? You need to focus on rhetoric. Now, I believe you do have to focus on demonstration and dialectic too, because if you just focus on rhetoric, what you're going to wind up doing is you're going to wind up being a professional liar. You're going to wind up being very persuasive, and you're going to persuade people of things that are not true, and you're going to fuck up their lives. Okay? That's not a moral way to live. You can't live that way. And eventually, it'll come back to you. You fuck up enough people's lives, listen to me. You fuck up enough people's lives, they'll come for you, man. They'll come for you. Okay? You don't want to do shit like that. So the demonstration is helpful because it tells you what's undeniably true, and then you can persuade people using dialectics or rhetoric of what's undeniably true. So I would definitely say study logic, right? I might even say study it first, even though most of the time you're going to use rhetoric, okay? So even though I'm telling you to study informal logic, and if you're going to study informal logic, I'll do a video on this. I write these notes down, everything I remember, something else I need to tell you. If you're going to study logic, I would use Genson's natural deduction system. I would not use an axiomatic system. I would not use even Aristotelian logic. I would use natural deduction, and you can look that up and Google that, and there's some great books on that. You definitely should do that, okay? But remember that most of the time when you apply what you've learned through deduction, you're going to probably present it rhetorically, okay? Why does all this matter for you? Because you're young. You're building your lives in a world that mostly just doesn't give a shit about the truth. I mean, I hate to say that, but we live in a postmodern world where there's questions about even whether there is such a thing as truth, right? Certainly all the grand meta-narratives that my father believed in, nobody has general agreement on any of that anymore. So you need to know when you're dealing with people who value truth and when you're dealing with people who value victory. And you need to know when you're talking to the educated and the wise people and when you're talking to the crowd. You have to identify this, what I call the kairos, the rhetorical situation. If you can get that right and then use the right kind of argumentation, the right kind of style of argument, you'll be very effective. But if you get it wrong, dude, you're gonna spend years trying to reason with people that you're not getting anywhere with them. You'll never get people's cooperation. You're gonna try to persuade experts with platitudes, and they're just gonna think you're a nutcase and you're a fake bullshitter, right? One of those sales guys that never follows through on what they really mean. Or you're gonna try to educate people who just all they want you to do is tell them what to do. You don't have to educate people; just tell them what to do, right? You have to know which tool's right for which job, and you just use that tool, no mixing, okay? If you try to use the same tool for everything, though, I guarantee you're going to get fried in certain situations, even though 90% of the time. The times that 10% of the time when you need demonstration or dialectic are usually those big, important times when it's going to be the difference between a $10 million deal or you can't pay the rent next month, right? So you have to be able to use all three of the tools, but you need to pick the right one and not make mistakes in using them. 3 modes of argument, 3 proper domains. You need to master those distinctions, and then you'll literally run circles around your peers who don't know this information. Young men consume content endlessly today. Podcasts, videos, threads, just hours of information. And then they sit on their ass and they do nothing. They feel like they've learned something, but how do they know? They didn't do anything with it. So here's a small test for you. The smallest possible test that I could possibly give you. If this content is valuable to you, subscribe. One click. Takes 2 seconds. If you can't do that, if you scroll past because you'll do it later, ask yourself, how many other small actions are you avoiding? The men who build things act on small decisions quickly. They act now. The men who drift let small decisions slide. Which one are you? Subscribe or admit something to yourself. My next episode, we're going to talk about how to recognize sophistry and why you need to learn how to defend against it, even in your own thinking. Until then, think clearly, speak effectively, know your audience. Now get off YouTube and go practice what you learned. This is The Jeff Younger Show. The Jeff Younger Show, signing off.